Halo semuanya, selamat datang kembali di channel ini. Jumpa lagi dengan saya Vicky Himpong. Bagaimana kabar kalian semua? Saya berharap teman-teman semuanya selalu dalam keadaan yang sehat. Oke, di sini saya akan memaparkan tentang pernyataan yang sering kali Pak Jokowi sampaikan bahwa Indonesia sedang menuju ke negara maju di tahun yang sudah ditentukan. Jadi ternyata ketika kita sudah membahas beberapa riset dari luar negeri kepada Indonesia, bahwa itu sudah menjelaskan berbagai macam program jangka panjang yang sudah dibangun oleh pemerintahan Jokowi, yang membuat perkiraan tersebut bukannya hanya sebuah surga telinga, bukan hanya sebuah dongeng yang disampaikan atau hanya sekedar ambisi yang disampaikan oleh Pak Jokowi, tapi berdasarkan data dan riset yang sudah dilihat, di mana terjadi ledakan ekonomi di Indonesia, membuat Indonesia masuk dalam pertumbuhan ekonomi tercepat di dunia. Ini yang sampaikan ini berdasarkan riset dari luar negeri, ya, yang mereka di mana suka melakukan riset pertumbuhan ekonomi dalam sebuah negara. Dan mereka menyatakan bahwa Indonesia adalah negara yang mempunyai pertumbuhan ekonomi tercepat di dunia. Kalian bangga nggak? Jadi apa yang Pak Jokowi sampaikan hari-hari ini adalah sebuah fakta yang tepat. Sebuah data yang disampaikan kepada kita bahwa Indonesia akan menjadi negara maju. Ini adalah hal yang sangat mengembirakan sebagai masyarakat Indonesia buat kita semua ya. Bahwa Pak Jokowi berhasil membuat Indonesia bangkit dari keterpurukan selama puluhan tahun. Ini yang menyebabkan bahwa 80% masyarakat Indonesia puas dengan kinerja Pak Jokowi. Kita akan membahas sebuah video dari luar negeri sana yang membahas kenapa Indonesia menjadi negara dengan pertumbuhan ekonomi tercepat di dunia. Kita akan sama-sama menyaksikan ya. Kalau kalian nggak percaya, ini buktinya. Link original video saya sertakan di deskripsi. Ini adalah judulnya. Why is Indonesia one of the fastest growing economies in the world? Kenapa Indonesia menjadi salah satu negara dengan pertumbuhan ekonomi tercepat di dunia? Kita akan sama-sama membahas penjelasannya. Saya sudah sertakan subtitle otomatis di sini supaya kita semua bisa mengerti ya.
This is Indonesia, a country made up of 18,000 islands and islets that are collectively home to 277 million people, making it the fourth most populous country in the world, behind only India, China, and the USA. If nothing else, this sheer manpower has made Indonesia a considerable economic player, with an economy only slightly smaller than Australia on a nominal basis, which easily makes it one of the most influential economies in the region, a region that itself has become highly influential. Indonesia is a rapidly growing market that is broadly halfway between India and China in economic development, with a few major advantages over both. The general global shift away from China as a centre of low-cost manufacturing is presenting a once-in-a-generation opportunity to Indonesia, which has an even lower-cost labour force, easy access to the world's oceans for trade because it's surrounded by the world's busiest shipping lanes, and it still has enough scale to comprehensively substitute the major industries that China has historically monopolised. The country's immense population is also bucking global trends. While the Asian economic powers of the last century are now struggling with ageing and declining populations, Indonesia's population is still very young, and it's growing, which means it will have a robust workforce for at least the next half-century. On top of all of this, Indonesia has immense natural resource reserves of oil and natural gas, precious and semi-precious metals, minerals, and some of the most arable farmland in the world. The country is capitalising on these advantages, and today it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But it is still very poor by global standards, and as we've seen countless times on this channel before with dozens of other countries, natural resource wealth doesn't mean much if it's not managed well. And if it's managed poorly, it can often be worse than having nothing in the first place. The country has immense potential, but realising that and successfully improving the living standards of 5% of the world's population is going to require overcoming some equally large challenges. Indonesia might be able to theoretically outcompete China in key industries, but that won't do it any good if it in turn gets outcompeted by even cheaper manufacturing centres in the region like Vietnam and the Philippines. Indonesia also has significant demographic, geographic and political problems, which could all quickly change its trajectory from one of the fastest growing economies in the world to yet another early 2020s economic failure. So, does Indonesia have effective enough economic management to make it into the global middle class? Could the country become a viable alternative to China for major global industries? And finally, would the current superpowers in the region even let this happen? Once we've done all of that, we can as always put Indonesia on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. I used to get ideas for videos like the one you're watching now from scrolling on social media and seeing what news people were talking about. But I found that this really skewed the kinds of stories I would get to see because I was just seeing outrageous stories that do well on social media algorithms, and I'd missed some of the most important things happening in the world. That's why I'm excited to talk about our sponsor for this video, Morning Brew. It's a free daily newsletter that gives you the most need-to-know stories in a quick and digestible format that I can get through in less time than it takes me to finish my first cup of coffee. It takes way less time for me to know what's going on than the hours I might spend scrolling through Twitter, and it's more entertaining than traditional news media, which often is just not that fun. Morning Brew has some great writers who bring some wit and levity to every newsletter.
Kita next
10 seconds to sign up. So you really have. But it provided the global economy with cost-effective manufacturing on a lot of the goods and services that we now just take for granted. Most people in advanced economies don't need to think too hard about buying basic household goods like kitchenware, basic furniture, or even an average television, where 50 years ago, they were all major purchases. The contents of most people's homes back then were worth more than the homes themselves. And yeah, sure, houses back then were a lot cheaper than they are today, but it still shows how much we are able to consume thanks to the increased industrial capacity of the planet. And countries like China specifically have been the largest contributors to that additional output. So, a country like Indonesia that has 2 of the 3 factors of production ready to go is something that everybody should be excited about. But land and labour are not enough by themselves in the modern global economy. The country's large workforce and abundant, well-positioned lands have always been there, and still, for most of its history, it wasn't a particularly wealthy country in its own right, especially not on a per capita basis. It had always, in one way or another, been missing that third variable: capital. The economy of Indonesia, as it exists today, really got started after the end of the Second World War. During the war, the country was invaded by the Japanese that wanted their rich deposits of coal and oil. The occupation was so severe that the average height of the Indonesian population fell a measurable amount due to lack of nutrition. Following the war, conditions didn't get much better. Indonesia, a previously Dutch colony making up the Dutch East Indies, followed the lead of many previous colonies at the end of the war and started pursuing independence. This was not a peaceful transition, and fighting broke out across the country between Dutch forces and pro-Dutch Indonesian civilians and the revolutionaries. This carried on for 4.5 years, further pushing the already downtrodden country into poverty. After their independence was recognised, conditions did improve, but only barely. The country lacked the infrastructure or even the government systems to be anything other than a colony exploited for its farmlands and natural resources. Building a government from scratch is a very difficult undertaking before even considering the challenges that came from almost a decade of conflict. The new leaders of the country basically needed to figure out everything from local government services to geopolitical alliances, something that even well-established governments with centuries of experience and establishment get wrong. What's more is that the skills of a revolutionary leader rarely translate into the mundane maintenance of a stable and confidence-inspiring economy. The original government was almost destined to fail, and in the mid-1960s, amid widespread hunger, severe poverty, and a 1,000% inflation rate, it did.
Dari 1960
It was
gagal
replaced
ya.
by a new regime that immediately set out to bring the country back under control by focusing on economic policy that would restructure foreign debt, make the currency usable again, and attract foreign aid to help the struggling citizens of the nation. Only after that were they going to be able to focus on grander ambitions of starting to grow the economy. The goal at this time was simply to reduce the suffering of their people. Part of these efforts involved a group of economists that went on to be known as the Berkeley Mafia. These were university researchers that fled the country during the conflict
Mafia
for independence and ended up studying at the University of California before they returned to Indonesia. The group was given a lot of authority to enact policies to get the country's economy back on track, and for the most part they were pretty successful. Between 1970 and 1980, economic output grew by over 540%, thanks largely to being able to set up the infrastructure it needed to start exploiting its oil at scale. Now, fossil fuels in particular are by no means a guarantee of economic success. That's because, while they can introduce a lot of money into an economy for a simple export, it's difficult to get that money to circulate in the economy to achieve positive economic outcomes. Oil facilities require very little manpower to operate, so they don't contribute much to employment, and it's also very easy for foreign companies to take a majority of the profits for these operations back offshore. It also increases the value of the local currency in foreign exchange markets because most oil sales are handled in US dollars, and then local oil companies will use those US dollars to buy their own currency. This artificially makes other exports less competitive, which means quickly the only viable industry will become the resource business. This is what is known as Dutch disease or the resource curse, and it's something we've seen before in dozens of economies we've explored on this channel. The Dutch really did do Indonesia dirty. The only thing that consistently makes the difference between the countries that truly benefit from their natural resources, like Norway, the USA, and to a lesser extent Australia and Canada, and the countries that end up like Venezuela, is the effectiveness of their government to use those resources to benefit the people of their nation. Given that Indonesia was on its second government in as many decades after fighting a war for independence, it would be reasonable to expect that they were more likely to end up in the second group. But all things considered, they did quite well. Economic growth was still heavily tied to natural resource prices, but the government used these revenues to invest in infrastructure to build out other industries. Having natural resources also meant that despite its relative instability at the time, the government could borrow money at low-ish interest rates because the loans were secured by a reliable source of foreign income. The country was building seaports and airports and roads and power plants and everything it needed to build out modern industries to get its people out of farms and into factories and offices where they could produce high levels of output and make themselves and the country a more prosperous place. Of course, it would be great if the story ended there, but it didn't. If the country kept growing like it did in the 1970s, it would be as wealthy as regional peers like Australia and Singapore. Today, it's wealthier than it ever has been, but still well below the global average because the country still has some major challenges to overcome. The new government may have been more effective than the one it replaced, but it was still highly corrupt in ways that limited proper industrial development, because something as simple as settling contract disputes was often won by whoever was the best connected or paid the biggest bribe. The population was also large, but not particularly well educated. Even today, only around 10% of Indonesia speaks English, which is the de facto international language of business. The government over its history has made investments into education, but it still lags behind even regional rivals like India, and this will need to improve if it wants to become a properly advanced economy, which again, it has the ability to do, as long as it can seriously address its major weaknesses. Upon closer investigation, its land is both a blessing and a curse. Yes, it's close to international trade routes, it's in a relatively safe corner of the globe, and yes, it's rich in natural resources, but it's also made up of thousands of islands rather than being one single landmass. This makes developing labour and capital infrastructure much harder than it would be in a country that's a single blob of land. Major industrial powers need to be able to move stuff around, and while the ocean is the most efficient means of transportation, it becomes less efficient when goods need to be loaded and unloaded, where in a country like China or the USA, they can just be moved on a single train line. The country has also had to make tough decisions about where investments are made. If the country concentrates a lot of infrastructure on its major islands like Sumatra, Java and Borneo, it would make everything more efficient, but it would come at the cost of starving other islands of industry and create regional disparities that would be very unpopular. Spreading out infrastructure solves this issue, but it makes everything cost more and it doesn't work together quite as well. Something like giving the country's 277 million people access to the internet is a significant challenge when cables have to crisscross back and forth across thousands of islands. Australia, which is the closest economy in size in the region, is connected to the internet via just 12 undersea cables. And Australia's geography is not exactly fantastic either, being large and very spread out with small concentrations of population centres all over the massive island. Indonesia has 217 cables just to connect the country to itself. And even then, a lot of its islands depend on slower phone line connections or have no connection to the internet at all, which means that they simply just can't be globally competitive in today's world. The challenge extends to everything the country does, not just the internet. The current growth the country has been experiencing in recent years has been fueled by a series of ambitious projects largely funded by fossil fuel and agricultural exports. It's fantastic that the country is reinvesting this money where a lot of governments would have just squandered it, but it's still going to take a lot to simply get it on an even footing with global rivals. The country's geography is presenting other challenges as well. Indonesia has recently announced plans to entirely relocate its capital city from Jakarta on the island of Java to Nusantara on the island of Borneo. If everything goes according to plan, the new city will open almost exactly a year from when this video is posted. This will be a city built from the ground up, which is not entirely unheard of for national capitals, but the reasons in this case are: Jakarta has become overpopulated, congested, and polluted. The city's air quality has recently been worse than the notoriously polluted cities like Beijing, Delhi, and Manila, effectively making it the most polluted city in the world. On top of all of this, Jakarta is prone to earthquakes, and it's sinking due to groundwater being pumped out to provide for the needs of the city's 10.5 million residents. The decision to move the capital is one that has been considered by successive governments almost since the country claimed independence. The decision to just go ahead and do it was made by the newly elected government that was built on a reputation of making big decisive changes. In addition to changing the capital city, the government, under a charismatic new president, has greenlit a series of major new projects at a rate that hasn't been seen in the country since the rapid growth period in the 1970s. Some of these are necessary, but some may be major missteps that end up costing the Indonesian economy and its people in the long run. Governments in advanced economies tend to move very slowly because good economic decisions normally only marginally improve living standards for regular people, where bad economic decisions can set entire countries back decades. Indonesia still has a lot of growing to do, and it has a lot of major advantages which could secure it as one of the largest economies in the world. But its inherent weaknesses could quickly catch up to it, making it just another story of a rapidly advancing economy that couldn't properly make the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy to an advanced service economy. Okay, now it's time to put Indonesia on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. Starting as always with size, Indonesia has a GDP of $1.2 trillion, making it the 16th largest economy in the world, just behind Spain and just ahead of Saudi Arabia. Indonesia gets an 8 out of 10. That output is produced by the world's fourth largest population. So even though its raw economic output is substantial, it's spread out a lot. For scale, its economy is still a fair bit smaller than Australia, which has a GDP of $1.6 trillion, but a population 1/10 the size at only 26 million. With a GDP per capita of $4,332, around a third of the global average, Indonesia gets a 3 out of 10. Stability and confidence is improving, but it's still not great. It has a relatively modest debt to GDP ratio of just 41%, which is up since the beginning of the decade thanks to spending on big infrastructure projects that we explored in this video, but down since the beginning of the new century. Corruption remains a problem, and it can't be ignored that the local population is still highly vulnerable to economic shocks. But with all of that considered, it gets a 5 out of 10. Growth has been very strong. Since the year 2000, the economy is more than 6 times as large as it was 23 years ago. It's also doubled in size in the last decade, and most economic projections agree that it will be the 3rd or 4th most powerful economy in the world by 2050, potentially beating out even the USA.
Yes.
Nobody can really predict the future,
Kalian
least
dengar
all
ya,
economists,
yang terakhir,
but for now it earns a 10
Indonesia
out of 10. Finally,
berpeluang mengalahkan Amerika Serikat dalam kekuatan ekonomi. Wow, luar biasa. Ya, Indonesia mempunyai pemimpin yang belum pernah didapati pemimpin berkarisma seperti Jokowi sejak tahun 1970. Luar biasa ya. Itu Indonesia benar-benar mengalami pertumbuhan tercepat di dunia karena hal-hal yang sudah disampaikan tadi. Itu benar-benar terperinci, dibahas dari sejarahnya, dibahas dari strategi yang dilakukan, dibahas bahkan sampai permasalahannya, korupsi sampai hari ini menjadi PR untuk negara ini. Lah, semoga video ini bisa menambah wawasan kita, lebih percaya lagi bahwa apa yang Pak Jokowi sampaikan bukanlah hal omongan doang, tapi itu adalah fakta dan data yang sudah diriset, bukan kita sendiri yang melakukan riset, tapi dari channel yang sudah memiliki 2 juta subscriber di YouTube, Economic Explain It, yang membahas eksklusif tentang Indonesia. Mereka penasaran kenapa Indonesia mengalami pertumbuhan yang sangat cepat, makanya mereka melakukan riset di sana. Semoga kalian semua bisa merasa teredukasi. Silakan tulis opini kalian di kolom komentar. Saya Vicky Himpong pamit, see you and God bless. Bye guys.